Well, hello and welcome to the new Tide Pod Challenge, which is me standing out in the midday heat in the Texas summer and seeing how long I can talk about Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality without fainting. So, in this video, I want to just kind of explain what Nietzsche's genealogy is all about, the conclusions he tries to draw from that at a broad general level. And then eventually I want to talk about kind of what Nietzsche could say about what's going on in the 21st century. What he would have to say about what happened in the mid and late 20th century, too. But first, we should talk about Nietzsche, and the way I want to do that is starting with a story. And that story is about two guys in Chicago, the Chicago area, in the early 20th century, and their names were Leopold and Loeb. They were young college students, and they had been friends for a while, and they decided that, in brief, to show that they were superior intellects, or superior men, superior kinds of people, they needed to show that they were above morality. And what that required in their heads was to commit a murder. So what they wanted to do was to show not only that they were good enough, strong enough, superior enough that they were not bound by moral dictates, namely do not murder, but also that they were smart enough to get away with it. Now they did the first thing. They committed the murder. They murdered this young teenage boy who they had actually kind of grown up in the same neighborhood with. I think they'd had some familiarity with him, but there was no motive about this particular kid. They kidnapped him, they tortured him, and they killed him. Now, they didn't accomplish the second thing, which was, remember, to get away with it because they were so smart. In fact, they made lots of really stupid, obvious mistakes, as often happens in these sorts of scenarios, and they got caught. And the purpose of this story is to talk about what their motive was. It wasn't anything about this kid. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't hatred or anything like that. Where did they get this idea that they needed to show that in order to show that they were superior, they needed to show they were beyond morality? Well, they got it explicitly from reading the writings, the musings of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century philosopher, German philosopher. He technically barely lived into the 20th century. He died in the year 1900. And Nietzsche had a particular way of philosophizing about morality, and in particular in these later writings, we could call it, with Nietzsche, his genealogy of morality. Nietzsche wants to try to tell us the story of how, here's where it gets a little dicey, at least our current moral sense, at least our current moral beliefs and frameworks came from. And he might be giving a genealogy of all of morality, depending on whether he thinks, I guess, that the Judeo-Christian way of doing morality has come to inform just morality simpliciter. All right, so those are the two components that he's really trying to do. This is from mainly drawn from a book called On the Genealogy of Morality, or depending on the translation, Genealogy of Morals. And what he's trying to do is give a story about how we got our current sense of morality. But that story is supposed to be a debunking story. And what I mean by that is it's a story that kind of undermines morality. This is not just history for history's sake. It's not just, well, cool, like we know where we got morality from, now let's keep doing morality. It's a story that once you know it is actually a criticism of the thing you're telling the story about, in this case, essentially Judeo-Christian, what Nietzsche might call European morality. So that's what he's doing. Here's a quote from Nietzsche. He says, let us articulate this new demand. We need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called into question. And for that, there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. And then in parentheses, he says, morality as consequence, as symptom, as mask, as tartuffery, as illness, as misunderstanding, but also morality as cause, as remedy, as stimulant, as restraint, as poison. we could delve into those that parenthetical comment for a while. But the point is that we're thinking about morality as something that developed due to contingent historical circumstances and circumstances that might not track truth. So, and this is the sense in which Nietzsche's genealogy is going to be a debunking genealogy. It's a story about how we got it that it actually makes you doubt the truth of it. So maybe it would be useful here to be able to contextualize this with a couple examples of debunking explanations not related to morality, not related to some genealogy of morality. So let me give you a couple. One made up just for the purposes of thinking through the concept, and one plausibly at least semi-historical, maybe with some fictional elements added in just for clarity. All right, so here's the first one. So you believe, say, that Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo, okay? And maybe even you believe that you learned this in a history class in college. In a good history class, and so you learned it in an especially reliable context. Okay, but then someone shows you evidence, really, really good, just like irrefutable evidence, that actually an hour ago you took a Napoleon pill, and this is not a real thing, in case it's not obvious, but a Napoleon pill is something that makes one think that Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo. That's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is it makes you think you learned that in a reliable context, like a history class in college. And the third thing it does is it makes you forget that you took the pill. All right? So if you learn that, and let's say you just have excellent evidence that you took that pill an hour ago and it takes that long to set in, if you learn that, you have a debunking explanation of your belief that Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo. And what that is it's a causal history of your belief that undermines your justification for that belief. You no longer really have any reason to believe that, assuming that the fact that you learned it in college or the fact that it seems true to you was your only justification. And that doesn't mean you should believe that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, but it does mean that you should lose confidence in that belief. You should probably abandon the belief that he won the Battle of Waterloo. That's the made-up example. Here's the quasi-historical example. I say quasi-historical because I'm going to have to add some elements to it just to make it a really clear example of a debunking explanation. So say you're a Catholic lay person that is a normal member of a Catholic church, not a priest or deacon or anything, in the 15th century. And what you've been told is that if you pay for an indulgence, you will spend less time in purgatory. All right, so purgatory, if you're not familiar with this, is the place you go before heaven where you're not going to hell, but you'd rather be in heaven. You got to spend some time there to be purified before you go to heaven. All right. But the Catholic Church tells you if you buy an indulgence, you spend less time in purgatory. Who are you paying the indulgence to, or who are you paying the money to? The Catholic Church. Okay, this is the historical part. This actually happened. The Catholic Church was saying this to people. People did pay the church to spend less time in purgatory. All right, and you've been given this elaborate theological justification for this and how it works. All right, and that's your reason why you believe it. And just because the priests told you so, or the bishop, or whatever. Okay, then you learn a new causal history of your belief. You learn that, in fact, what actually happened was there was this smoke-filled back room. I don't know why the room has to be smoke-filled, but somehow that's important in these explanations. There was this smoke-filled back room where the top people decided that they needed money to build a new cathedral. Okay? And they didn't have that money, they weren't getting that money, and so how could they get that money? Well, they decided, let's make up this lie about getting out of purgatory faster by buying indulgences, and then we'll get the money to build this new building. So if you learned this new causal history, and again, let's just suspend belief on whether it's actually true or whether I've presented it accurately, but if it were that way and you learned that, you've really just learned a debunking explanation for your belief that indulgences buy you out of purgatory. It's debunking because you learned a new causal history for how you came to believe the thing. It wasn't the theological stuff. It was actually the smoke-filled back room. And it's one that undermines your confidence, or at least should undermine your confidence in this belief. So it's you're learning a causal history, a story of how you got the belief that actually shows that you should at least lose confidence in the belief, but you should probably in the most clear cases of debunking explanations, you should abandon the belief altogether. So that's what a debunking explanation looks like, or there's at least a couple examples of it. Okay, so here's how he does this. He's going to say, what he says is that morality originally was very different from what it currently is. And Nietzsche was a philologist. He studied languages and the history of languages. And he gives this linguistic argument for this claim. But here's the claim. The claim is that morality was originally associated with nobility. It was associated, this is why he calls it the master morality. And what eventually comes is the slave morality, which overturns the master morality. But it's originally called the master morality because it's the sort of values of the aristocracy. And what he thinks is that morality originally enshrined the characteristics of the nobility in various societies. Not just Europe. He talks about Greece. He talks about Japan. He talks about lots of different Germanic peoples. So what he thinks is that morality originally enshrined the traits of the nobility. And he thinks actually first it meant just the noble. It just meant those people who were the aristocracy. And then relatively quickly in the great timeline of things, but it comes to refer to the characteristics of those people. Not those people themselves, but the characteristics that those people have. And so it's associated with power. It's definitely not associated with the masses. It's not morality is not something that everyone can attain. It's not even something that most people can attain originally. And it's peculiar. It's not universal. It's not something that everyone should be doing. In fact, it's not something everyone even could do, because it's something that you actually have to be in this upper echelon of aristocracy to even be able to do. So you could see this when you look at the ethics of, say, Aristotle and lots of the ancient Greeks. If you go look at Aristotle's virtues, one thing you'll see there in this list of virtues is a virtue called magnificence. It's a virtue of giving of resources. And you might think, oh, well, that's just generosity. But that's not generosity. Aristotle has the virtue of generosity. What magnificence is it's the virtue of giving large amounts of resources. So generosity is something a lot of people could have. It's the virtue of, just giving of resources or small amounts. It's the virtue that would tell you that you should give to this charity the $20 that you can spare. But that's not what magnificence is. Magnificence is the virtue of giving large amounts. So think about the kinds of people that could give huge amounts of money. That is a very small minority of our population. I mean, depending on how you define huge, but I'm thinking at least tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands. In Aristotle's society, it would have been different. But this is a very small group of people. But Aristotle talks about this as a virtue as not in a different class from the normal virtues. It's just one of the virtues. And we should try to attain it, of course. And what this seems to belie is that, Aristotle might be talking to a particular class of people. Again, this is the Nietzschean sort of interpretation of Aristotle. So we're kind of playing a little bit fast and loose here with Aristotle. But this is a virtue that I think everyone would agree only a small number of people in any society could have. And Nietzsche says, yeah, there you go. That's how virtue and morality used to be thought about. It's the traits of the people at the top. There's another thing about Aristotle's list of the virtues that Nietzsche would really harp on, which is there's nothing in Aristotle's list of the virtues about pity or benevolence in general. So this is something about the master morality that we didn't comment on yet. We talked about being the traits of the noble and the characteristics that they have. But what's lacking, Nietzsche says, what's lacking from the original master morality is any sense of general beneficence or pity, any sense of any virtue that is concerned with just caring for people in general. He does have generosity in there, and lots of the virtues are other-oriented, but there's nothing that's a general virtue of beneficence. And that's a key point for Nietzsche. Morality was not originally, at least the master morality was not originally about just generalized pity or compassion or something like that. It was about traits of strength and nobility. So look at other virtues on Aristotle's list. Courage. Who were the people in ancient Greece who fought? Well, it was the noble classes. It was the people at the top. It wasn't the slaves. It wasn't the peasants. It was the people who could arm themselves, who could afford to go out and do battle, these hoplites. And so for Aristotle, courage was about the battlefield. It wasn't about, facing your fear of spiders. It was about being displaying these sort of traits and attitudes on the battlefield. So again, it's a trait that in Aristotle's mind would have only applied to the aristocracy, to the people at the top. All right, so that's the master morality. Then you have what Nietzsche calls the slave revolt in morality. And what this is, of course, if you have the morality, the master morality originally being about the aristocracy, well, the aristocracy is a minority, and so you have the other people in the society, whatever you want to call them, the slaves, the peasants, the masses. And of course, they don't have the power in that society, kind of by definition. And Nietzsche says they don't have strength, they don't have means, they have to operate in other ways. They don't have the ability to overcome or overthrow the master class or the aristocratic class by strength. They have to develop other traits like cleverness, he says, intelligence, reflection, maybe even deception. And what happens is you have this group of people who can't overthrow the masters by force. They have to do it by deception and cunning. And the way they do that on Nietzsche's story is they accomplish an inversion of values or a slave revolt in morality. And so everything, using the terms that had come into existence from the master morality, the terms of good and bad and these moral categories, they switch things. And instead what they do is they say, actually, all of the traits associated with the masters, with the aristocrats, with the nobility, those are actually the bad things. We're going to switch it. Those were the good things before, now they're the bad things. And actually what's good is the things associated with the masses, the peasants, the slaves. Things like weakness, vulnerability, need, and Nietzsche even argues things like ugliness, things like ill health come to be valued. What's happening here in this inversion of values is not just the inversion of values, right? Nietzsche argues that what happens in the slave revolt is also an inversion in another sense. So in the master morality, Nietzsche says, the master morality says yes first and then no. So it gives us, he says, it gives us a conception of what the good is, or what the good life is, or what it is to be noble and good. A positive vision, you might think. And only then, almost as an afterthought, does the master morality in Nietzsche's thought give us any vision of what's bad. And it actually only gives us a view of what's bad that's derivative of what's good. What's bad on the master morality is just what impedes the good stuff. So you've got a vision of the good life, and you can see this when you read Aristotle and Plato and all the ancients. They want to give us, in giving us an ethical treatise whenever they're writing about ethics, they tell us straightforwardly, we're obviously talking about what it takes to live a good life, what it takes for someone to live a good life. And then that's the primary topic. And then they go on to say, well, if we're talking about what's bad, that has to be defined relative to what the good life is. The bad, what's negative, and what we should avoid is just the things that are going to impede the good life, right? That's what the master morality does. And Nietzsche says the slave morality does something different. It first defines what's evil, and he only comes to use the term evil as opposed to bad in reference to the slave morality. That's where the concept of evil comes into existence. And they first define what's evil, and how do they define what's evil? It's just the masters. It's just the characteristics of the master morality or of the aristocrats. That's evil. So that's their primary definition. And then they only derivatively come to define what's good. So it's a derivative definition in that it only works in reference to their definition of what's evil. What's good on the slave morality is just, not being evil. That's what good is. And so we've got two things that happen in the slave revolt. First, you get an inversion of values. You get, what was bad before is now good, and what was good before becomes evil now. But you also get a reversal of the order of definition. So originally good, we had primarily a vision of the good life, and then we defined the bad only in reference to the good. It's what impedes or prevents the good life. The slave morality switches the values, but then it also depends on a definition of evil as its primary ethical concept, and only derivatively defines what's good. Okay, so those are kind of the two big movements in the slave morality, or the slave revolt in morality. And like I was referencing earlier, who are the kind of primary culprits in the slave revolt? Well, for Nietzsche, it's the Jews and Christians. So it's the Judeo-Christian notion of morality that is the primary kind of vehicle of the slave revolt in morality. You can see this. We can talk about this in multiple ways. We could look at the Jewish Bible, what the Christians call the Old Testament, and you can see lots of aspects of this there. There's some obvious ones where you can appeal directly to scriptures. Like here's an excerpt from Deuteronomy chapter 10. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. All right, so we actually get two aspects of the slave morality here. One of them we haven't talked about yet, but on the slave morality, equality is also good. Impartiality is good. That's not something that would have been good on the master morality. But of course, if the masses take over morality, they're going to say, well, what's good, of course, is being impartial, because that's what's best for the masses. It's not good if you're the minority in control. You don't want impartiality. You want something that benefits this minority. But then more directly to our purposes, what's characterized as good here in a roundabout way, what the characteristics God has here, is that he loves the weak people, the fatherless, the widow, the sojourner or the refugee. These are all people, and especially in the context of this ancient society, who would have been utterly powerless and weak, at the bottom of the barrel, societally speaking. And if you read the Jewish Bible or the Christian Old Testament, same thing. You'll see this over and over again. You can see this throughout the Proverbs. You can see this throughout the Psalms. You can see it throughout the prophets. Read any of the prophets. And Israel is constantly being castigated for not having enough concern with these groups of people: the weak, the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the refugee. Jesus is the same way, of course, in the New Testament, but we'll get there in just a second. There's other subtler themes in the Old Testament that attest to this. So think about, we have to get ourselves into this mindset of the ancient Near East, but think about the theme that runs throughout the Old Testament of second and in fact third and fourth and fifth and even 11th sons being given pride of place over first sons. So think about Jacob and Esau. The story, one of the themes in the story of Jacob and Esau is that Jacob, by cleverness and deception, gains the upper hand and receives the blessing over Esau. So again, there's so much going on in the story, but one of the things going on in the story, one of the motifs, is that the second son is getting favor over the first. In this patriarchal society where things pass down like this, things pass down to the first son in a way that they didn't pass down to the second son even. And so for the Bible, for the Old Testament to be making this, implicit claim that this second son is given pride of place over the first, that he's in some sense more valuable or gets blessings more than the first one, is really kind of making a deeply countercultural point in that time, and one that Nietzsche would say is evidence of the slave morality. It's the person who was traditionally thought of as weak or inferior being inverted as the better person, the more valuable person, the person with more moral worth, the person with more blessing. Again, you can see this theme. If you read the Old Testament, you'll see it throughout. Cain and Abel. Cain, of course, kills Abel. Abel was the better son. He's the one that got the blessing, but guess what? He was the second son. Go and read the story of Jacob's sons. This is the story of Joseph, and the famous story of the coat of many colors. Joseph is the one that is receives all of the blessing. He's the special one. He's the one the story is about. Guess which son he was? He was the 11th of 12 sons. Okay, so Joseph being given the blessing is, again, like if you were anywhere outside of Israel in this time, and probably at a certain point in Israel's history, even in Israel, you would have read this story and said, what? This is like, this doesn't make any sense. It would clearly hit you as something that they're trying to make a countercultural point. And what that point is for Nietzsche is inverting the values of the times. Hey, we all know that the first son is the best. That's the one that gets the blessing. And then Israelite literature, the Old Testament, comes in and says, nope, it's actually the second, over and over and over again, right? It's actually the 11th in the case of Joseph. Okay, so those are inversions of values in Jewish scripture. Fast forward to Christian scripture, you have even more blatant cases like, let's just go to the one that hits you right in the face when you read the New Testament, which is the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says, again, this is Jesus being deeply countercultural. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Okay, we'll come back to that. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are you when others revile and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Sorry. Okay, so we have a few different things going on in the sermon. One is multiple categories of just vulnerable, pitiable people being their values being inverted, and now they're the blessed ones. The ones who are weak, the ones who are hungry and thirsty, the ones who, hungry and thirsty for righteousness, which in this context seems to imply like, well, because they need justice. They're being mistreated. Blessed are those who are meek, those who mourn, the people who, would have said that's the most pitiable condition to be in, is those who have lost close relatives, those who have lost mothers and fathers or children even. And Jesus says, nope, those are the good ones, right? Jesus is deliberately, intentionally inverting values in the way that the Old Testament does, in the way that the whole Judeo-Christian tradition does. And what he's also doing is he's enshrining certain values or certain virtues, which is, what does he say? The merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. Again, these are the people who are pursuing slave morality values, people who want people to be treated fairly, people who want the weak in society to be lifted up, to be given justice. Okay, here you have a New Testament version of the slave revolt, or evidence of the slave revolt in morality. Okay, so now, earlier I referenced Nietzsche talking about this being European morality. And lest you think that what Nietzsche is doing here is just giving a criticism of a religious tradition, that's not what he's doing. Oh, well, it's part of what he's doing. But he thinks it extends far beyond that. So for Nietzsche, Judeo-Christian morality has actually come to completely inform, I would say, in my terms, Western morality in general, European morality, but American morality, Central American, South American morality, because of the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition on those cultures. Now, a lot of people want to downplay this, and they think that, well, we can separate out Western values from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And my humble opinion is that is too headstrong. We don't often appreciate the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition on what would now be categorized as secular Western values. So think about things like the UN. Here's the motto of the UN on the website: peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. We also have the UN pushing, one of their huge pushes is for refugees. Again, now, this is not to say that the Jews are the only people who have ever cared about refugees, but at least in Nietzsche's mind, and I think there's a case to be made here, it's that Judeo-Christian tradition which inverted values that has led to the point, with lots of steps in between, where the UN can garner so much international and cultural support and financial support for supporting refugees. Right? If you go back and you look at Aristotle, or you read Plato, or you read Confucian philosophy, or you read Nordic texts, you see nothing that puts refugees at the center of morality. You see nothing that puts the weak really at the center of morality. And I think Nietzsche's got a good case here. This would have been alien to them to center all of our moral energy, so to speak, around these weak, vulnerable classes. But go back again. So I talked about the refugee agency, the arm of the UN, but even just the motto: peace, dignity, and equality. Okay, so think about dignity and equality. These are slave revolt values for Nietzsche. The masses want equality. The masses want dignity. They want to be respected because they haven't earned it. They have to be dignified because they are not in a powerful position that has already earned sort of honor, I guess. You could almost contrast the concept of honor and the concept of dignity to each other. Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist who says that we transitioned at some point in the 20th century, or maybe late 19th century, from an honor culture in the West, or at least in America, to a dignity culture. And he's argued actually that we've transition now to a victimhood culture. But the honor culture, is a culture where your value is defined by your honor. Honor cultures are aristocratic cultures, right? People in those classes are the ones who can gain and establish and lose honor. Dignity cultures are egalitarian cultures, and you don't need power or societal clout or respect from others to have dignity. You can have dignity independently of the honor you have gained by your actions or your wealth or your aristocracy or anything like that. And so dignity is a value of the masses, a value of the slave classes, according to Nietzsche. And similarly with equality. Nietzsche is down on equality and down on democracy because he thinks these things are part of this inversion of values. When you couldn't gain power by strength or by force, you change morality so that morality includes everybody gets an equal share of resources or of dignity or anything. Nietzsche, I think, would also have a lot to say about certain cultural movements happening today. And I think, kind of ironically, while you might feel up till now, the last 15 or 20 minutes is Nietzsche pushing against people on the sort of conservative religious sphere, people who endorse and really heartily endorse the sort of ethical vision of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Well, it bites the other way too, really weirdly, because the contemporary political left would be probably one of the primary targets of Nietzsche today. Particularly because everything on the left now, for reasons we could go into and hopefully will in another video, everything on the left now is focused on the victim. The victim has pride of place, right? So think about movements like anti-body shaming movements. Think about movements like the movement against ableism, of course the movement against racism, of course the movement against sexism. What do these all have in common? They all have in common that they are mobilizing against the oppressor and in favor of the victim. What they're doing is they're saying the victims are the ones we should focus on, and in fact they're the good ones and the oppressors are the bad ones. They're doing the bad things. And who are the oppressors? The oppressors are the people with power, historically or even just contingently currently. So white, straight men are the people who have been in power historically. So they're the bad ones. And in fact, a way on the left currently of criticizing something is criticizing it as white, straight, male. And you've done enough. You've done everything you need to do to criticize that thing because you've associated it with those classes of people. there's nothing more clear in this case that these classes in power are bad than that you can have an argument against something just by associating it with those classes. And similarly, it works the other way too. If something is associated with these victimhood classes, and again, because of the way this goes, the more victimhood classes you can meet, the more power there is, and the harder it is to criticize that thing. Again, this would be the primary target of Nietzsche's criticism today. That is an inheritance of the slave revolt in morality, the thing that takes the low, the weak, the vulnerable, the powerless, and says those are the good things actually, and the bad things are the things with power. And in fact, you see this in the political left today too, that just the power itself seems to be on its own bad, right? Anytime there is established, even historical, especially if it's historical power, that seems to be associated with bad. Privilege alone is a kind of power, and when the left criticizes privilege, they're not criticizing bad privilege, they're criticizing privilege. Well, what is privilege? It's a kind of power. It's an ability to do things that others lack. Described in neutral terms, that doesn't seem bad, but on the left it is bad. And again, this is a direct inheritance of the slave revolt for Nietzsche, because just the fact that it's power is bad in this ideology. Now, there's one more aspect of contemporary progressive leftist political culture that Nietzsche, I think, would have strong words to say about. And remember, when we talked about the slave revolt and morality, we talked about not only the inversion of values, the things that were formerly good like power and nobility and privilege being bad now, but we also talked about this feature of the slave revolt where instead of defining first a positive vision of the good life and then only then defining what's bad, not only defining it second, but defining it only in reference to the first thing. The bad is only defined in reference and derivatively of what's good. That's the master morality. Well, in the slave revolt, it's the opposite. So you start with what's bad and what's evil. That's your primary ethical concept, and that's your primary ethical focus, is talking about what's evil. And only then can you talk about what's good. And what's good is just not doing the evil stuff and not being part of those evil things. Okay? And you could make this case for the Judeo-Christian ethical tradition. I think it would be an unfair case. But think about the emphasis on avoiding sin, for example. Think about confessions in the Catholic Church, or here's the Anglican confession. I confess to Almighty God, to His Church, and to you that I have sinned by my own fault in thought, word, and deed, and things done and left undone, especially blank, and then you bring in your own sins. For these and for all other sins which I cannot now remember. You have to confess the sins that you can't even remember committing. I am truly sorry. Pray that God have mercy on me, etc., etc. So you could make a case here that the Judeo-Christian ethical tradition is excessively focused on the evil first. It only defines the good life derivatively of what's evil. The good life, if you want to take things uncharitably here, is just not sinning in the Christian tradition, and the Judeo-Christian too. The Judeo tradition too. What's the good life? It's not committing sins. It's avoiding sins. You can read, open up any prayer book, lots of catechisms, and you could get this impression that what's good is just not sinning. And what that is that know first mentality of the slave revolt. If you're thinking through the Nietzschean lens here, you're defining what's bad first, and then the good life is just not doing that stuff. Now, I think that's a little unfair. The Westminster Shorter Catechism, for example, it asks, what is the chief end of man? Now, if you're Nietzsche here, what you're looking for is for it to say, oh, the chief end of man, what's the meaning of life, the goal of life for humanity? Oh, not sinning, not doing the bad stuff. That's what you'd expect if Nietzsche was right. That's not what it says. It says man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And that's not the no first and only then the yes. That's the yes first. That gives us a positive vision of the goal of humanity. Now, whether it's right, I don't know. But it's not doing the thing that Nietzsche says that slave moralities do. It's not giving us a negative and then a positive. It's giving us the positive vision of the good life first. It's not saying the good life is not sinning. It's saying the good life is glorifying God and enjoying Him forever. If you want to go back to the Jewish tradition, go back to literally the first page of the Bible, where you have in Genesis chapter 1, God creating man in His image. And then He says, He blesses them and He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and now over every living thing that moves on the earth." Now, this is the first command that God gives to people. Okay, it's the first command in the Jewish and the Judeo-Christian tradition in general. It's the first command that God gives to humans. And what does He say? Does He say, "Listen, I got this list of things you can't do, and what I want you to do is just avoid doing those things"? That's not what He says. No, He says, no. Here's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go out, make more people, spread order in the way that I have started spreading order here in this garden, and be the rulers of the earth. Take care of it. There's nothing in there that is no first and then yes. In fact, it gives us a positive vision of the good life for humans. But if you fast forward or rewind, I guess, to where we took off on this little side note, think about the at least the American political left, and I guess the political left in the West in general, in Europe certainly. What do you have, and what is one of the things that you see? Well, again, what you see often is an insistence or a total focus on what we shouldn't be doing. What's evil and what's bad. What they can talk for a long time about avoiding oppression and doing away with colonialism and doing away with homophobia and doing away with ableism and doing away with fat phobia and all of these things. But what they're not doing while they're doing all of that is giving us a positive vision for the good of humanity. They're not telling us what humans are for. They're not telling us what the meaning of life is. And if they are telling us that, the only answer they're giving us is, don't be an oppressor. And what that is it's taking a view first on the nature of evil and what we shouldn't be doing, and only giving a view of the purpose of humanity that is derivative of that, which is avoid that stuff. Okay? So we've got this primary definition of bad and evil, and only a derivative definition of what's good. And so at the same time as Nietzsche pushing against religious conservatives, he's also pushing against, I think probably more strongly against the political left these days than he is even against the political right. Although you could probably make a very similar case for the political right. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but this has been a really brief introduction to Nietzsche's genealogy of morality. I talked about how it might apply, or how he applies it directly to the Judeo-Christian ethical tradition as a slave morality, as a result of the slave revolt in morality. Not just a result, but I guess he attributes the slave revolt itself to the Jews pretty strongly. But also how he might have some problems applying that to the Judeo-Christian ethical tradition. It's not exactly as he says it should be if it were a result of pure slave revolt in morality. And at the same time, we've applied it beyond what Nietzsche was able to see in his own time to the American and probably the Western political spectrum in general, seeing how Nietzsche has a pretty poignant critique of the political left and progressivism in general.